Let's talk about the armour of the Astartes with some thundering tracked vehicles, crushing grav plates and mighty Land Raiders, with an overview of the best Space Marine tanks in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marine tanks and how good the various metal boxes of the Adeptus Astartes are in-game. I think armoured units and gun tanks have been a much bigger deal in 10th edition in general versus say 9th edition. They have their big toughness increase, and generally for their respective armies, they're priced as big scary damage dealers that can win direct firefights but do have other disadvantages beyond that. Things like grabbing objectives and movement around terrain pieces and lines of sight all can be downsides for the immense firepower that they can bring. I think it's kind of nice to have a bit more of a balance though. Back in 9th edition it seemed that unless your firepower units had the core keyword for Space Marines, they weren't usually worth talking about too much. And also it's really cool to see Land Raiders actually functional on the tabletop. That hadn't been the case for a very, very long time, but it's been nice to see Games Workshop get the balance of making them a big armoured transport tank that's got some firepower and actually be a credible option, and that's been rather nice too. I'd say that as 10th edition has gone on, the balance of Space Marine vehicles has largely been further fine-tuned, and now I'd say it's at the point where just about all of the Space Marine vehicles are at least usable. Though we're still in a position where I think realistically you're often going to want to take some things rather than others by quite a long way. For this video focusing on tanks, I thought we'd focus on gun tanks and armoured vehicles that are primarily focused for shooting, so it's not going to be every single vehicle that Space Marines have to offer. We're not doing flyers, storm speeders, artillery or dedicated transport vehicles for this, or fortifications. None of them feel like they're really tanks in their own same way. The only walkers I've made the exception for are the Ballistus Dreadnought, which is pretty much a walking heavily armoured gun turret, and I thought I'd mention the Redemptor Dreadnought as well, given it feels that one is kind of similar and perhaps slanted more to range than melee, even if realistically it does a bit of both. In any case, for this one I've chosen to rank the tanks into 4 rough tiers of power level. Though obviously there's a bit of nuance to that, certain armies will get far more out of certain things, and some things work a bit better in Ironstorm versus elsewhere. I'll try and talk through a bit of that as we go along. First up, and the one that I've chosen to rank as the weakest tank, is the Space Marine Astraeus. This one's the Forge World Super Heavy for the faction, and clocks in at 525 points. I probably would say it's the least likely to see play in any sort of competitive list for a couple of different reasons, though even this one I'd argue isn't so horribly behind the curve that it's not usable in casual games. For the very big points cost, it's got some big stats: 24 wounds at toughness 12 with a 2+ save and a 5+ invulnerable save. It is fairly sturdy, about 1.5 Land Raiders worth, but still maybe not crazily stand out at a big 525 points. It definitely needs to be very tanky, though I guess it's a great target for Armour of Contempt if it starts to get focused by things. Otherwise it gets a lot of shots with its Accelerator Cannon at strength 9, AP 1 and damage 3 with twin linked and sustained hits, and then either Melter or Plasma Sponsons that do a significant portion of its damage as well. Overall generally being fairly threatening, though I'd say its damage output is kind of low for the points cost it is, at least compared with buying multiple smaller tanks. In competitive play it also has the big downside of its enormous physical profile being hard to move around terrain, which if you're playing on some sort of fixed terrain set is almost certainly going to mean it can't go into certain areas of the board, just not really working very well on certain maps with the current Titanic movement rules. Overall it's kind of fun as a big centrepiece, and I feel like it could be usable enough casually, though it's unlikely to outcompete most of the rest of the tanks for the amount of value they bring for their points cost. Next up, and I guess tier 3 for this video, here's a bunch of vehicles that I think are a bit overshadowed. Again, all playable, but generally not really taken quite as regularly in competitive lists for various different reasons. Here I've chosen to rank the Predator Annihilator, Gladiator Valiant, Whirlwind and Land Raider Crusader. The Predator Annihilator is a fairly simple and effective las cannon gun turret. Its role is doing scary las cannon shooting out to 48-inch range. It gets 1 big twin-linked strength 14 one and then 2 sponson ones, and then it has built-in damage rerolls of 1, which is genuinely quite a helpful insurance against rolling low against big tough things. Otherwise it also has a hunter killer missile and a storm bolter to back it up. I feel like out of the Space Marine tanks that destroy tanks, this one is just a bit overshadowed by basically everything else. I don't really think it's that far from being fairly good. Maybe you knocked 10 points off it, it'd be a lot more tempting for a very cheap tank to fill that niche, but at the moment I think it just fails the comparison versus most of the other things. The Predator Destructor with las cannon sponsons is far more popular as it's just more general purpose, and 6 shots with the damage 3 autocannon isn't actually as far behind the turret las cannon as you'd expect for anti-armour. The Vindicator brings more damage and is far better armoured, capable of taking a lot of firepower with Armour of Contempt. The Lancer brings better range damage for the price, with much more reliable built-in rerolls, and the Ballistus Dreadnought's a competitor as well. Built-in hit rerolls and more flexible damage profiles, plus better defense due to its 2+ save for the same points cost. Overall I feel like a 10-point drop or so could have people taking a second look at it. Next up we've got the Gladiator Valiant, the close range and multi-melter version of the Gladiator chassis. This one's 160 points and packs 2 multi-melters plus the Las Talon turret, an Icarus pod and Hell heavy stubber, and it gets its +1 to hit rule when it's attacking the closest enemy monster or vehicle model, which can up its damage output a fair bit. The main issue with this thing is that it's not really all that tough and needs to play pretty bold. 2 multi-melters make up a significant part of its damage, and it'll only be able to fire those if it's within 18 inches, so it needs to go at least somewhat close to the front line, maybe ideally getting within 9 inches if it can for the big damage boost. The strength 9 and 10 profiles might also have a little bit of trouble against some of the tougher monsters and vehicles out there, toughness 11 or 12, though I still think between that and having a fair few shots with good AP and damage, it's nice enough both against vehicles and against heavy infantry. It'll get on well with the Firestorm Assault Force with the Advance and Shoot, Strength 10 melters within 12 inches, and maybe Vulcan Hestar's rerolls as well. The Templar version can make it even more threatening. For 10 points you get to triple down on those multi-melters, making it far more fearsome, and like the rest of the tanks it'll enjoy Ironstorm Spearhead, though basically they all do. Due to needing to get kind of close though, and not really being all that tough, it tends to get very rarely played compared with the other Space Marine tanks out there. I feel again this one probably should be a little bit cheaper. I think few people are going to take this one when the Lancer is the same points cost. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Tabletop Stronghold, one option for transporting miniatures from A to B, and they make a line of magnetic carry cases manufactured in the USA that they can ship around the world. Magnetic cases have been a pretty popular trend over the last decade of 40k or so. The idea that you put magnets on the model's bases, attach them to magnetic sheets, and it stops them moving around so you can fit loads of models in a tight space without them rubbing on each other, as you can see here. Tabletop Stronghold's specific offering are called the mag cases. These things are made from MDF and are kind of notably sturdy and durable, and then they have steel trays that can slot in at various different levels, so you can vary the heights of the levels as to the miniatures that are being transported. The trays that you slide in are made of steel, and then on the front to protect them there's a nice clear acrylic sheet, which means that you can see the models as they're being transported, which I think is kind of fun, to display the painting as they're on the move. All transport systems have their pros and cons. These ones can be a little bit heavier than some due to the MDF and steel, and of course you can DIY your own magnetic solutions. There definitely seems to be room and popularity for some purpose-built stuff though. Generally people that I've talked to or seen reviews of have been happy enough with theirs, so feel free to check out the link in the video description if you're interested. They currently have a Black Friday sale for 30% off. In any case, thanks for sponsoring this one, and I'll cycle back to them to talk through a few of their designs at the end of the video. Getting back to the Astartes Armour, and next up we have the Whirlwind, 180 points for the Space Marine artillery tank, D6 plus 3, strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2 shots, fired indirect, now capped to hit on a maximum of a 4+. But even so, that should stack some semi-reliable damage on things out of line of sight. We'll need Space Marines on 2s, and the blast rule might come into effect. Artillery tends to be costed at a big premium in 10th edition, just due to the power of being able to wipe out certain lighter objective grabbing units or stack damage on fragile damage dealers that the opponent doesn't want shot yet. In general, it seems that the Whirlwind's priced at a point where the vast majority of army lists aren't choosing to put one on the table, not worth the trade-off versus the amount of other things that you could get for them, but have seen the odd one used in competitive lists either on their own or even as a battery of 3 of them. Indirect fire often tends to be kind of powerful all or nothing, where you've got some really good reliability that you could say wipe out an important unit of objective grabbers each turn. At the moment I rate them as usable but kind of niche, a bit of a luxury to be able to have the power to strike at some choice targets, but you really need to make sure that firepower is really contributing to you winning the game, either through killing some important stuff that was about to destroy your unit, or taking out enemy units that are going to score points in some way. Next up for this tier we've got the Land Raider Crusader, 220 points, and again like the rest here, not really truly unusable. It is the cheapest Land Raider if you want one to deliver some scary stuff into melee. Land Raiders are very tough for the cost, and this one is the cheapest way to get those holes on the table. 16 wounds at toughness 12 with a 2+ save is very nasty, particularly with Armour of Contempt and cover. The Crusader is the one with the biggest transport capacity if you want to fit some very big units in there, and for its weapon systems it goes all in on the anti-horde firepower. Hurricane bolters with 24, strength 4, AP 0 damage 1 shots that are all twin linked, plus a twin assault cannon and a multi-melter. Basically it does mean that it's really good at destroying lighter infantry hordes, but not really too great against anything else, even if it will stack at least some saves on literally anything. In general though, it's just the other Land Raiders that stop this seeing quite as much widespread play, either just being seen as worth the 20 points to upgrade to some scary las cannons, or 60 points to upgrade to those terrifying flamestorm cannons, Maybe a bit of an element of you've got a really big durable unit that's worth paying a bit of a premium to make sure that it genuinely terrifies the enemy and makes them have to try and deal with something so tough. Moving onwards and upwards, here's a bunch of other tanks and armour that maybe see a little bit more competitive play, though I certainly would rate some of these as stronger than others. Here I've chosen to talk about the Ballistus Dreadnought, Predator Destructor, Gladiator Reaper, Repulsor, Land Raider and Baal Predator. All strong options, but maybe not the absolute top tier for Marines potentially. First up, we've got the Ballistus Dreadnought and the Predator Destructor. I'd rate both of those towards the upper end of this list. The Ballistus Dreadnought felt kind of tame, but then the 10-point cut I think really put it back into contention. For the 130 points, it's a cheap and effective gun turret. The most notable thing about it is how tough it is. 130 points for a 2+ save on 12 wounds at toughness 10. Really is quite a lot to slog through, particularly if it can get cover. And due to having a sort of medium damage output, the opponent's probably going to want to dedicate firepower elsewhere. And even if it gets bracketed, it's not likely to feel that quite as much as other things due to its inbuilt hit rerolls. For its firepower, it gets 2 individual las cannon shots, a twin storm bolter, and then 2 crack missiles at strength 10, and they can be swapped out for 2d6 frag shots with AP nothing and damage 1 but good enough strength. It makes it at least a little bit general purpose, even if it's probably most valuable against things like, say, toughness 10 vehicles. And its special rule allows you to reroll all hit rolls against targets that are either half strength or greater. And that does make it kind of reliable, and not needing to go with Oath of Moment at all, so you can use that elsewhere, even if it does mean that you can't really increase its firepower that way if you wanted to. At 130 points I think it's really quite usable. Perhaps the biggest danger is that it just gets a bit ignored versus other things in your army. And if you're comparing versus all the other shooting profiles, it doesn't do quite as well against things that the missile launcher wounds on a 5+, so maybe a little bit less dedicated anti-heavy armour than some. Feeling like it's a very direct competitor of the Ballistus, there's the Predator Destructor at 130 points. This one does feel like it's got lots of similarities. You still get 2 las cannon shots, though you don't get the inbuilt rerolls of the Ballistus. Then its autocannon is fairly scary, either 4 or 6 shots depending at range, at strength 9 AP 1 damage 3, and both profiles get some extra AP versus infantry targets. And that can be really meaningful against things like Terminators perhaps, particularly for the AP1 autocannon, where that's going to be a really useful buff if it does wind up going after medium or heavy infantry. Overall, this one tends to be far preferred over the Predator Annihilator, and if it's firing at targets out of cover, the autocannon is pretty similar in terms of damage output to the twin las cannon, though it does fall behind if it does get cover saves. Overall, it can generally still do kind of fine against armour, but is far better against things like Terminators or standard Space Marines versus the Annihilator, so it tends to get the nod more often. Again, I'd rate it as really quite usable. I feel like I've seen a good chunk of people using this one in Ironstorm, where it gets on pretty well with the single rerolls. Next up, we've got the infantry shredding Gladiator Reaper, 160 points for a tank with a twin heavy onslaught Gatling cannon on the turret. 12 shots with devastating wounds and twin linked, so should average at least some devastating wounds against all targets, plus some AP1 Tempest bolters on the sponsons. The big Gatling cannons get sustained hits too when they target enemy infantry, which is quite a big deal. That basically means that you have an extra 50% damage on average, and overall it maths out to being really quite effective against just about any flavour of infantry, obviously 1 wound infantry, but with the devastating wounds and stat weight of fire it's kind of fine against even things with 2+ saves. Again, it's maybe one that tends to get play more in the Ironstorm Spearhead more so than other places. That just seems to be quite a good home for it, given that a lot of Space Marine army lists don't tend to have as much trouble in dealing with enemy infantry. Lots of random strength 4 attacks going around in Space Marines between most of their infantry close combat profiles and extra bolt-on things on vehicles, but Ironstorm might just have a little bit less of that than some, and can be quite nice with some of the stratagems such as the critical hits on a 5+ one, which is particularly nasty with sustained hits too. Otherwise, the Templar version with the bolt-on multi-melter makes it a bit more well-rounded with a couple of big punchy high AP shots, and overall its main weakness is that, again, like the Gladiator Valiant, it's not really all that durable. Wants to be at least somewhat close and aggressive, and its damage output is far better against infantry, fine enough against heavy infantry, but better against light. Maybe could be worth it if you built a Space Marine army list with very little anti-horde, though as mentioned they seem quite popular in Ironstorm to back up all the tanks that can deal with heavy stuff well. Next up we've got the standard Repulsor, 180 points, which to some extent feels like the Primaris version of a Land Raider, really quite a big transport capacity. And then this one a big rumbling grab fortress, crushing all before it, and having all manner of guns sticking out on every different side from it. For the 180 points, its stats are fairly impressive. 16 wounds at toughness 12 is going to take at least a fair bit of focused anti-tank, and even if it's not quite as crazily durable as a Land Raider, it is far cheaper, and then between its different weapon profiles it's got quite a lot of things that it can handle stuff with, usually taking a twin las cannon, loads of scattered shots with its defensive array, and then choosing between a heavy onslaught Gatling cannon or a las talon for a bunch more higher AP goodness. I've seen more people take the las talon recently, though I think both of them are kind of fine. Then it's got a big transport capacity that can deliver range shooting things a bit better more so than melee. I feel like if you're buying a particularly fancy transport for melee stuff, then a Land Raider is going to be better with its special rule, but this one's really quite nice to deliver things like Hellblasters, Eradicators, maybe Aggressors with Fire Discipline, or even Infernus Marines. And then once they've disembarked and dealt their damage, if the only way that the opponent can deal with them is charging them into melee, then it can threaten to pull them back within the transport and keep them safe for one more turn. Overall it's pretty powerful and threatening, tough enough to keep its cargo safe and deliver it to fight. With ranged and transport things, it quite enjoys the Firestorm Assault Force, lots of nice transport tricks for that, including the Get Out and Shoot one, and it's solid for delivering Gladius Fire Discipline combos, such as Hellblasters, Eradicators or Aggressors there, and some assurance that they get to work on something important. I'd say its main downside is that it's kind of merely okay for damage output. Certainly not awful for a transport, but not crazily impressive, to the extent where you'd really want to take it as a mainline battle tank. Even so though, it is pretty cheap. I'd probably rate it on the upper end of this tier, or in top tier potentially. Next up we've got the standard Land Raider for 240 points, like the Crusader. It's a really big chunky transport with 16 wounds, toughness 12 and a 2+ save. Does the same job in delivering scary melee troops into close combat. And then the regular Godhammer variant has its twin las cannons, so contributes a whole bunch of big las cannon fire that the enemy can't really ignore. Pretty helpful if your list is kind of light on that. It does have the smaller transport capacity compared with the other Land Raiders, only 12 models, so certain things might struggle to fit, say for example Aggressors with a character attached. For things like Blade Guard with an attached character, 3 Assault Centurions, or maybe a 10-man squad with a couple of characters attached, it does absolutely fine though. Again, maybe it could be most interesting for certain specific chapters, with one of their named characters leading something nasty and melee focused. Finally for this tier, I also chose to rank the Baal Predator here. It's 135 points for a great big Flame Predator tank. The Flamestorm cannon on top is one of the Redeemers essentially, d6 plus 3 shots at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2. Then usually backed up by heavy flamers on the sponsons. Between all that you've got a tank that can do a serious amount of damage at close range and also is a really big threat for Overwatch. It can move really quite fast and its turret Flamestorm cannon has got quite a good range. So ideally it wants to zip up to somewhere in the midboard and then ideally park somewhere that the opponent is going to want to move into, likely within range of an objective marker. And if the enemy tries to take it with a light infantry squad or something, then burn away with 3 flamer profiles. I would say that this one is probably a little bit on the lower end of this tier, perhaps borderline between lower tier 2 or upper tier 3. I feel like I liked it quite a lot more at 125 points rather than 135. It doesn't really have any huge synergy with the Blood Angel's primary strengths, and at the moment I don't really think it stands out particularly versus all the core codex tanks that you can take, some of which are very nice. And while it's good against a bunch of targets, it's not really that general purpose. Say if you're fighting knights or monsters, they're not really going to care too much about the Overwatch for it. I still think it has its interest and uses though. Moving on though, and here are some of the armoured shooting vehicles I might consider some of the top tier tanks for the Space Marines right now. We've got the Land Raider Redeemer, Repulsor Executioner, Vindicator, Gladiator Lancer, and then the Redemptor Dreadnought if we're counting it. As mentioned earlier on, I feel like it functions a bit more of a tanky gun platform more so than a melee dread, so I thought it was at least worthy of a mention here. Seeing as we're talking about it, we'll kick off with the Redemptor. It's 210 points for a big stompy vehicle with a big macroplasma incinerator, generally much preferred over the heavy onslaught Gatling cannon, so d6 plus 1, strength 9, AP 3 and damage 3 shots to roast the enemy with. Then a regular onslaught Gatling cannon, 2 storm bolters and an Icarus pod. Its damage output is fairly nicely general purpose, better against elite infantry and clearing out some light infantry versus taking out tanks and heavies. Whenever it's wounding things on a 5+ with a macroplasma, it's going to be kind of disappointing. But between a whole bunch of damage profiles, it is one of the vehicles that's likely to at least cause some pain on the enemy army as it stomps up. You maybe can ignore it for a turn or two, but it will gradually make its presence felt more and more. And against certain targets, the macroplasma is actually very nasty, anything that relies on high saves and is 3 wounds, maybe more so if you're getting extra blast shots on the go. The standout thing for the Redemptor though is maybe its durability. 12 wounds with a 2+ save at toughness 10 and then -1 damage. Ideally it wants to be trying to get cover if it possibly can, and then with Armour of Contempt you can potentially have a very hard vehicle to take down. The -1 damage is just generally helpful, but ridiculously so against damage 2 or damage 3, where it really takes out a really big chunk of the enemy firepower. Again, they're perhaps most often played in Ironstorm Spearhead, though I've seen odd Gladius lists choosing to run them. The Macroplasma likes the big rerolls, there's a specific Warpicker stratagem for them, and some of the support for them is rather nice. They get on very well with Tech Marines in general, getting the +1 to hit, and in particular restoring those wounds that have -1 damage when you try and take them off is really nice. But they can make good use of basically all the enhancements in Ironstorm as well, including potentially that one for critical sustained hits on a 5+ if you go for it. Of course it's a multi-role dreadnought as well, so it does actually have some melee punch when it gets close. 5 attacks at strength 12, AP 2 and damage 3 is okay, though it's not crazy for 210 points. It is nice enough though that if the opponent does close on the gun line, it does have the potential to at least slap a few elite infantry dead on a good roll. Overall it's certainly a pretty pricey dreadnought, but still one that seems to see a fair bit of competitive play. Next up we've got the Land Raider Redeemer for 280 points. We've already talked about Land Raiders twice over, good defense and delivering units to melee. The big advantage of this one of course is the Flamestorm cannons, so basically the Baal Predator but twice over. 2d6 plus 6, strength 6, AP -2 and damage 2 flamer shots. That's enough to kill around about 6 standard Space Marines with average rolling, and it won't care if they're in cover or not either. It's also got a twin assault cannon for some devastating wounds goodness and a multi-melter as well, and potentially it could kill another squad of enemy infantry in the enemy turn as well if they decide to move around in front of it with a rather glorious flaming overwatch. As with the other Land Raiders, exactly what goes in it might depend on the chapter. Likely a chapter specific character leading some sort of scary melee combo, though plenty of things can work. Maybe things like fire discipline aggressors might find this one a particularly good home. It's exactly the right number for them. I have seen some people using it as a transport for a shooting unit like Eradicators as well. That could work pretty well in Firestorm, where even if they're not using the move drop charge thing, you're still having a transport with a massive amount of terrifying firepower and are able to deliver scary melter stuff into close range. It does have far higher points cost than the rest though at 280, though I still think it's the one that I've seen played most in competitive lists recently. It still seems to be generally considered worth the investment, given the ability just to flat out delete certain squads moving on to mid-board objectives. Next up, for 220 points we've got the Repulsor Executioner, which I think is definitely a good tank, though I'd probably put it towards the lower end of this particular tier. It maybe feels like one that's particularly good in Ironstorm more so than other places. It's 220 points for the same Repulsor chassis, toughness 12 with 16 wounds and a 3+ save, and then typically people tend to use it for its good anti-tank damage, with its 2 attacks with that heavy laser destroyer at strength 16, AP 4 and damage d6 plus 4. It's certainly nowhere near as reliable as the Gladiator Lancer, but can maybe take more buffs as a result. The Ironstorm rerolls matter more for it, it'll hit on a 2+ if it's ever stationary, and if it's on the move it can be more meaningfully affected by Oath of Moment. So quite a few ways to up its damage output, and is a pretty reasonable target for a command point reroll if you fail a wound roll too. On top of that though, it comes with a lot of secondary shots to clear out enemy infantry. A heavy onslaught Gatling cannon is a pretty massive threat just in itself. Then it's also got a twin heavy bolter plus a lesser defensive array and some other stubbers and things. It feels like one where the big primary shot certainly might do something, and on a good roll from time to time might just one-shot an enemy tank. But hopefully as it's doing that it should be able to just absolutely ruin a bunch of infantry units it can see as well, repelling them from the midfield in style. It does have a small transport capacity as well, which you might be able to make use of, though I've seen lots of people just not really bothering with that. I guess could be good opportunistically if you had units that were going to be foot slogging anyway. And otherwise for Ironstorm it can get on well with most of the enhancements, and as one of the biggest, most points intensive Space Marine vehicles out there, it can justify the stratagems being spent on it perhaps better than any. Putting out loads of damage with Mercy as weakness perhaps, and being a very good candidate for the returns fire at half health one. You could also justify Tech Marine to support it pretty well with all of those gun profiles. Most of the time I think it's going to want to move despite the heavy keyword on the laser destroyer. Next up we've got the brutal siege breaker that is the Vindicator tank, 175 points for a massive demolisher cannon attached to a Rhino chassis, and generally just considered a bit of a strong all-rounder. D6 plus 3 shots at strength 14, AP 3 and damage D6 is going to be fairly bad news for basically whatever it shoots at. Its average damage lands somewhere between the Repulsor Executioner and the Gladiator Lancer's laser destroyer, but again it can be buffed with things like Oath of Moment, Ironstorm rerolls or Tech Marines. and it's a bit more general purpose than them as well, with a fair few shots plus the blast keyword, so it can also be solidly efficient against medium heavy infantry as well. On top of that, its durability is genuinely quite good as well. 11 wounds at toughness 11 with a 2+ save. Again, we'll really like both smoke and armour of contempt, and while it does have the downside of having a somewhat small range, it's maybe a tiny bit happier operating on the front lines than some, with the ability to fire within engagement and hit things in close combat even with a blast keyword, or just not take any penalties in general. Again, it's not a nice big fairly high investment tank that can justify Ironstorm stratagems and support, and quite likes a few of the other detachments as well, with options to advance and shoot from things like Gladius or Firestorm. It's rarely a particularly bad choice if you want to add a bit of hard-hitting anti-armour. Finally, for our look through Space Marine tanks, we've got the Gladiator Lancer. This one's been a staple since the start of 10th edition, hasn't really changed too much and still remains a very efficient source of anti-armour. Though compared with the edition's start, I feel like a bunch of other vehicles have got better to the extent where they're good competitors of it. In any case though, it's basically a dedicated long-range tank destroyer, 2 shots at strength 14, AP 4 and damage d6+3 with that laser destroyer, and then it gets 2 b-roll, a hit roll, a wound roll and a damage roll, on average getting around about 10 wounds or so, against a vehicle with a 3+ save out in the open, though of course it's kind of swingy as to whether or not you actually convert those shots. It basically seems to math out as the best anti-tank damage at longer range for the cost, and while you can't support it with other things quite as well due to already having all the rerolls and things it really needs, it does mean that if you have these, you don't have to use Oath of Moment on your gunline vehicle things, you can use that somewhere else. It does have a few supporting weapons as well, things like the Iron Hail Stubber, some Storm Bolters and an Icarus pod, so it can chip away at some lighter infantry units at least a little bit. In general, it just seems to be a pretty easy plug and play unit though, that you can just put into a Space Marine army list, and then all of a sudden you've got a genuinely fearsome source of anti-tank in the army. I've seen quite a lot of people opting to run 2 of them for a bit of reliability, and perhaps insurance against one of them getting popped too early, to know that you've still got some long-range anti-tank that can do the business. The main weakness is that it's not really very general purpose, as that laser destroyer only really does big tough things. It's also not particularly tough either for the cost, at least compared with a bunch of the other Space Marine armour besides Gladiators. In any case, I'll leave that there for this one. Let me know what you make of these Space Marine tanks and armour in Warhammer 40k right now. Which ones will you rate as the strongest or weakest in game, and which units out of your collection have been making their way into army lists or been spending time on the shelf. Finally though, I'll just cycle back to today's video sponsor in Tabletop Stronghold. As mentioned earlier, one supplier of magnetic carry cases, made by a company based in West Virginia. They ship worldwide and currently have a big Black Friday sale on for the next week or so. As mentioned earlier, they're basically MDF carry cases with steel trays in them. You magnetise the models on and put them on the trays here. This image giving a fairly good impression of how many models you can fit on each one of these, around about 90 or so 25mm bases, around 30 Terminators or 6 Knight Armigers, so you can fit quite a lot per level if you rank them up nicely. For the different sizes they have of these, there's the Mag Case Mini one, in the sale at £65, $70 or €88. That figure includes shipping but might exclude VAT or import duties depending on where you live. If in any way unsure about that, you can contact the guy himself. The smaller one can still do a fair size force, should be able to handle most combat patrols, and it can still fit some really big chunky tanks like that Spartan there on the bottom layer. The cases come with magnets to mount on the bases of the models, 70 included with this one. Then there's the regular mag case, £107, $115 or €128 while on sale. This one's the more standard one that should be able to handle really quite a lot of big armies. You can see the amount of knights that you can fit on the bottom layer of that one, the Chaos Knight at the bottom giving you a sense of the height of this thing. I'll put the dimensions for the size of the boxes on the screen. And then there's the really big option, which is basically 2 of the previous attached together. They can cost a little bit less or more depending on how many of the steel trays that you want. There's options for either. This one should be able to do the majority of really big armies. I'm sure that could fit most 2,000 point armies with ease. And it also demonstrates the clear front that clips in on that to display miniatures while carrying them around. In any case, thanks to Tabletop Stronghold for sponsoring another video here on the channel. Feel free to check them out, links down in the video description. Their sale event will be on for the next 7 days or so. Let me know your thoughts as to the Space Marine vehicles down in the comments, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. There's all the usual things down in the video description, such as the channel's Patreon page if you'd like to support, and discount links if you happen to be picking up any Warhammer in the near future. They also support the channel as well. In any case though, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.